Hey guys, so I'm going to very briefly talk about the War of 1812, and just not all of it, but just some of the important points. So in 1808, after Madison was elected for the first time, he had to immediately deal with the British. So the British, remember, the British are oppressing American sailors. They are violating U.S. neutral rights, and the United States kept trying to negotiate, but England is fighting for its very survival, so it was having none of it. So after he was elected, Madison, he just had to watch as the United States went more and more towards war, and there was almost nothing he could do to stop it by the time he came into office. So the cause of the War of 1812, one was, again, U.S. violation of U.S. trade and commerce. Two, impressment. Three, the British actually started, after Madison entered office, the British started putting tariffs, custom duties, on U.S. ships leaving U.S. ports. That means a foreign country, former colonizer of America, England, is putting tariffs on American ships. That is not allowed. You cannot put tariffs on other people. You can put tariff on other people's countries' goods, but you cannot put tariffs on other people's ships. Basically, England was charging the United States to use the Atlantic Ocean. An ex-federalist that joined the British, our power upon the waves enable us to dictate the terms upon which ships of all nations shall navigate. Not a sail shall be hoisted except by stealth, without paying a tribute. That is unthinkable to allow a foreign country to put tariffs on American ships. And the United States couldn't do anything about it. It did not have a navy. The navy had been just gutted. So that's a third factor, is England putting tariffs. There was also a fourth factor, and that was problems out west. Now, as Americans kept moving west, and they moved west fast, they kept running into Native Americans, because obviously the Native Americans lived there. And Native Americans were understandably upset, and so they would attack Americans. Well, this happens over and over again. Americans, as they move west and they're attacked by Native Americans, they always blame the British. That's what that cartoon is. A British officer paying Native Americans for their scalps. There maybe was a case of that, and the British would trade with the Native Americans. And the British also weren't against encouraging the Native Americans to go attack Americans, but the fact is, even without the British, the Native Americans were going to attack because their land is being taken. And so Americans, though, they always said, it's the British. And this is especially true in Indiana, where there's a guy named William Henry Harrison. You don't have to memorize this, but keep this in the back of your head, because he is important later for several things. William Henry Harrison was the governor of Indiana, and he was especially notorious for doing that practice of getting, taking one Native American from one tribe who doesn't represent the whole tribe, getting him drunk, and then having him sign away all the land. Well, the Native Americans got very upset about that, especially one named Tecumseh. Tecumseh tried to organize a confederacy. Ultimately, William Henry Harrison put it down. It's called the Battle of Tippecanoe, which will make William Henry Harrison a national hero. Keep that in mind for later. But more importantly, it told Americans that Americans insisted that this was caused by the British. And there was some evidence that the British were assisting the Native Americans. But again, Native Americans mostly were upset that their land was being taken. And so, with all these factors together, by 1811, Madison had just ran out of options. The United States did not have taxes, so it didn't have a steady revenue source. Remember, most of its money is coming from tariffs. The government's money is supposed to be coming from tariffs, but because of Jefferson's embargo, trade had pretty much stopped. And U.S. ships also there have to pay tariffs to the British, so there was no money in the federal coffers, so there's no military. So having completely run out of options, Madison called America's diplomat home. breaking diplomatic relations is always the first step before going to war. As soon as you break diplomatic relations, it means the two countries have nothing to speak about anymore. So all these things led a new group of Republicans. These are young Republicans from the South and West that were called war hawks, to say we have to go to war. And two examples that you absolutely must know, because we will talk about them extensively. John C. Calhoun from the South and Henry Clay from the West. John C. Calhoun is from South Carolina, and he is incredibly important. We'll talk about him. Henry, they're both incredibly important, and we will talk about them a lot. But they said, it doesn't matter if the United States is not prepared. It doesn't matter if we don't have ships, if we don't have a navy, if we don't have soldiers. We need to go to war. Otherwise, the United States might as well become a colony of England. It's being treated like a colony. So they said, it doesn't matter. Out of a matter of principle, out of a matter of honor, we have to go to war. Usually, when people say things are about principle or honor, usually they're just blowing smoke. In this case, they are not. England was not treating the United States like it was a sovereign, independent nation. And the only thing America could do was go to war. Now, this was an incredibly divisive war. It is the vote to go to war was the closest of any war in U.S. history, because Federalists to a person opposed this. Republicans, even though they were very anti-war and anti-military, they supported this because the United States, by 1812, it had run out of options. It couldn't force England to respect it, and England was not respecting the United States. So the United States went to war. Now, the important thing to understand about the War of 1812, I'm not going to go into the military aspect very much, unfortunately, but what you really need to know is the United States came into this just grossly underprepared. By 1812, war with England had been looming for more than a decade. For more than a decade, we had had no taxes, and also the military had not been built up. No taxes, great. Who likes to pay taxes? No one. But there are consequences to it, and the consequences are universally bad. So in terms of the economics of the War of 1812, it was a disaster. Well, so first Madison had to be elected, because 1812 was also an election year, and he ran and he won again. But if you look at the numbers, between 1804 and 1812, Federalists keep doing better and better and better. And so if you follow the trend, it looks like the Federalists might win the next election. So Federalists, they are viscerally opposed to this. They'll be so opposed to this that they come across as traitors to the United States. It looked like they were supporting England over America. And again, the consequences of this were absolutely terrible. So very briefly, the U.S. economy was terrible throughout the war. And it was because of Jefferson and Madison's policies. So in terms of the economy, the Secretary of the Treasury, a guy, a Republican named Albert Gallatin, he's from Sweden. He's absolutely brilliant. And he told Madison, we need to build up the economy. So if you remember the Bank of the United States that was created by Hamilton's economic program that Madison and Jefferson opposed, well, it was chartered for 20 years. And its charter came up in 1811, right before the War of 1812. Gallatin said, we need a Bank of the United States because it keeps the whole financial system of the United States more in check, more in line. But they let it lapse, so there was no Bank of the United States. The United States banking and financial system will be a complete disaster. That's why the United States government will have to go to foreign countries to get loans, because the U.S. banking system, which means the U.S. financial system, was non-functional. Second thing it meant was taxes. The government had no money. No money's coming from taxes already, because there hadn't been any since 1800, and no money from tariffs. So if you have to raise money in a crisis like this was, it is going to be way more expensive. So even though Jefferson and Madison had been viscerally against taxes, taxes had to be raised to the highest level they had been in U.S. history up to that point. And now it's a time of emergency. Taxes were raised to an all-time high, And obviously, Americans screamed bloody murder about this. And it wasn't even enough to pay for the war. So over the 3 years, from 1812 to 1815, the U.S. debt will go from $45 million to almost $120 million. So more than doubles. Because most of the war had to be paid for by borrowing money from foreign countries. It got so bad that in 1814, the U.S. government just stopped paying on its debt, which effectively means it defaults, meaning the United States government in 1814 went bankrupt. So economically, the war was an absolute disaster. Militarily, it was not much better. There had been nothing done to build up the military throughout the entire period, even though England and France were not treating the United States like a sovereign independent nation. There was no attempt to put a check on that. So the army itself only had about 6,700 soldiers, and they were not well trained. One of the first things Congress did is pass a bill to increase the size of the military to 25,000. And the government, though, couldn't offer them weapons, couldn't offer them uniforms, so no one wanted to join. So the federal government only brought in like less than 10,000 people, and it had the right to bring in 25,000, but it could not convince people to come fight for the U.S. government. So the Army was a disaster. The Navy was a disaster. There were 16 ships in the U.S. Navy, full-size ships. That is compared to the British, who have more than 1,000 warships. We have 16 warships, 16 vessels, and none of them are nearly the size of England's, versus more than 1,000 for the British. And on top of that, the generals that were put in charge of the war, they were all heroes of the American Revolution. Well, that was so long ago that most of them were old and senile. Most of our commanders have generally slunk into either sloth, ignorance, or habits of intent for drinking. So overall, the War of 1812 will have more military disasters than successes. And you definitely will not have to know this, but generally War of 1812 is broken up into 2 campaigns. The first campaign is in 1812. In 1812, right as the war started, England is still fighting over in Europe, fighting against Napoleon. And so the United States launched a 3-prong attack up into Canada to take Canada. Every time it's happened in the American Revolution, Americans are always like, yay, we're going to go liberate Canada from the British. The Canadians are always not interested. Americans are like, yay, we're here to free you. People in Canada are like, no thank you, we're good. They didn't want to be liberated from the British. Americans are always like, we're going to go save them. So America launched 3 attacks, and to make a very long story short, they were all disasters because of how bad the U.S. had prepared militarily. Some of them, especially over in Fort Detroit, were hilariously bad. Don't have time to get into it, but 3-prong attack, it failed, and Canada stayed a part of England. Now, then in 1814, disaster struck for the United States. In 1814, England defeated Napoleon. What that means is now England could put all of its attention onto the United States, and England was coming for the United States with a vengeance because England was pissed. People in England said Americans had betrayed England, stabbed England in the back right as England was fighting for its life. And so the British came back hard to punish Americans. Not going to go into the details, but there were some successes by the United States, mostly on lakes, and there'll be one really exceptional one. But the thing you should know, you should probably do, is the British burnt Washington, D.C. to the ground. And the way they did it is so sad and stupid. You don't have to know this, but I'll just tell you. The British, they actually launched an offensive to take Washington, D.C. and Fort McHenry. And they landed, it was only like 5,000 British soldiers. And the British soldiers, they dropped them off in Maryland, and they just marched into Washington, D.C. unopposed. The capital of the United States was not protected and defended. And here's how bad it got. When the British soldiers were marching into Washington, D.C., into the White House, James Madison and his wife Dolly were sitting down to dinner. They didn't even realize that the British were coming. This sounds like it could not be true, but I swear, look it up, it is. The British marched into the White House right as Madison, right after Madison and everyone else in the White House had ran out the back door. And it was so close that when the British came in, the dining room table was totally set. The food had been put out. The food was still steaming. And there was wine in the glasses. So the British sat down at the table, toasted to the health of King James Madison. And then they burnt the White House to the ground. And then they burnt the rest of Washington, D.C. to the ground. Because they were pissed. So the U.S. Capitol was burnt to the ground. Now, supposedly, and this there is actually, I've read that it's true and I've read it's not true. So I'll tell you, but it's with that caveat. Why do we call the White House the White House? Supposedly, after the War of 1812, after it was burnt down to the ground and it was put back together, it was built back up, there were still burn marks. How do you get rid of burn marks? White paint. Supposedly, there was no record of it being called the White House before this, and right after this is when they started calling it the White House. Again, that is one of those things. I've read places that said that's not true. It's a good story. So the capital of the United States was burned to the ground. Now, luckily for the United States, it's still a third world country. And third world, in European countries, if you take Paris, you take Berlin, you take London, the war is over. But in the United States, it's such a third world country. They burned the capital to the ground. So everyone in Washington, D.C. just got up, moved to another city, and we're like, all right, this is our new capital. Let's keep going. So pissed off Americans, but it did not end the war. The British, you definitely don't have to know this. The British then went on to go take a place called Fort McHenry. And most of you probably know this, but they started bombarding Fort McHenry September 13th. On one of those ships, there was a lawyer named Francis Scott Key. Francis Scott Key was trying to negotiate the release of prisoners, but after the firing started, they said, you're not allowed to leave. So he had to sit there all night and watch as Fort McHenry was bombarded. And then when he woke up the next morning, by the dawn's early light, the flag was still there. And so he wrote a poem to it, put it to a British pub or a drinking song, and that's where we get Star Spangled Banner. So that's one benefit from the War of 1812. England was launching a three-pronged attack. One of them was Washington, D.C., Fort McHenry. They got D.C., not Fort McHenry. Another one was a battle on a lake called Lake Champlain. You definitely don't have to know it, but the United States actually won there. The United States did surprisingly well on lakes because England couldn't get its boats there, so both sides just had to build up their navies. So it had some successes, but the most important success was the third prong of their attack in 1814, New Orleans. New Orleans is the most important. It was the second most important city in the United States after New York, and will remain the most important until Los Angeles was opened up. And the Battle of New Orleans will pit one of England's greatest commanders, Edward Pakenham, along with 8,000 of the best trained British soldiers. He and the soldiers had just come from the fields of Europe, defeating Napoleon, so they are very skilled. It's some of England's finest. And against them was Andrew Jackson and 4,000 of what can only be described as a motley crew. There was 2 black regiments, one of them slave, one of them free. There was Irish Americans, Mississippi Dragoons, militia from Tennessee, and some Native Americans, Choctaw, and also some pirates, Jean-Pierre Lafitte. Jackson basically said, we need everyone. And he told the pirates, like, yeah, if you come fight with us, then I will make sure the government pardons you for all of your pirating. But Jackson just said, bring in everyone. And so Jackson and 4,000 volunteers of just every stripe versus Pakenham and 8,000 of England's best. To make a very long story very short, it was a disaster for the British. British launched an attack, and it was foggy, and American cannon especially just tore them to pieces. Let me just tell you the casualty. Casualty, that is the amount of people killed, missing, and wounded. For the British, they will lose 10 officers, 250 killed, 1,260 wounded, and 484 missing. So a casualty rate count of more than 2,000 for the British, including Pakenham himself. He was killed. On the U.S. side, the United States lost 11 killed, 23 wounded. So casualty rate of 33. 33 versus more than 2,000. It was a smashing victory. And this is America's greatest victory in the War of 1812. And this is what will propel Andrew Jackson to become, he was just called the hero. After this, if you saw it in the newspaper, the hero is visiting New York with a capital H. That meant Andrew Jackson. It made him a national hero and will eventually propel him to be president of the United States. And what's really funny about the Battle of New Orleans is it took place after a treaty was signed. In December of 1814, the United States and England had worked out a treaty to end the fighting called the Treaty of Ghent. Battle of New Orleans, it happened several weeks afterwards, so communication was so bad back then, though, they didn't get the news in time. The Treaty of Ghent ended the War of 1812, status quo antebellum. That's Latin. Antebellum means before the war. Status quo means everything stays the same. So according to the terms of the Treaty of Ghent, neither side won anything or lost anything. So why does it matter then? The War of 1812 ended with neither side gaining or losing anything. So is there a winner and a loser? Does it even matter? And the answer is yes. It really matters for at least three reasons. First and foremost, and most importantly, since the United States had first started, was first created, even back to the Articles of Federation, throughout this entire existence up to this point, England had never once treated the United States like it was an independent, sovereign nation worthy of respect, because the United States wasn't big and strong enough to force other countries to respect it. And when it comes to international politics, you cannot expect other countries to respect you just out of the goodness of their heart. You have to have muscle. So, the United States, it had proven something just by fighting. It may not have gained any territory, but the United States proved that if you piss us off, if you keep pushing us, we'll fight you, even if we are not ready, even if we're not prepared. The United States, it had a lot of defeats, more defeats than victories, but it still had some significant victories. There are two, especially on the lake and the Battle of New Orleans. Think of it like this. Me, David Park, goes into a boxing ring with Mike Tyson. At the end of 12 rounds, we're both standing. I'm bloody, I'm beat up more, but I've landed some serious hits on Mike Tyson. And most importantly, we're both standing. Who has won that fight? Me. I'm a historian. He should have had me knocked out in round one. If he didn't knock me out in round one, he's already lost. But I lasted 12 rounds and I got some good hits in. After the War of 1812, after the Treaty of Ghent, England never once treated the United States like anything but a sovereign, independent nation. The United States proved something just by fighting. That is why the War of 1812 is sometimes called the Second War of Independence. Had to go back to war with England just to get them to treat the United States like it was an independent sovereign nation, and it worked. Second reason the War of 1812 is significant is it fundamentally changed the Republican Party. The Republican Party, under Jefferson and Madison, had supported a small government, cutting the military down, generally not being military prepared. It was against Hamilton's economic programs, against taxes, against debt. And who could who could Madison blame for the War of 1812? Only Republicans and Republican policies. And this is important to understand because the War of 1812 fundamentally changes the Republican Party. After the War of 1812, when Madison is still president, he will call for the creation of another Bank of the United States. And he had been one of the biggest opponents of it when Hamilton had called for it. But the U.S. banking system was such a disaster. He'll call for a new Bank of the United States. He will enact new taxes, just like Hamilton had called for before. He will also create a bigger military. He'll call for a bigger navy. He will abandon all the strict construction ideas that he had before and all the small government policies because they had just proven ineffective in a crisis. So we'll get to this more next lecture, but Madison will fundamentally, the Republican Party will fundamentally change, and they'll start adopting and calling for the exact things that the Federalists had called for, which is a third significance of the War of 1812. The death of the Federalist Party. The Federalists had opposed the war so much, they looked like traitors when the war was over. And so because of that, they will lose more and more support throughout the United States. In 1860, when Madison runs again, he wins overwhelmingly, and by 1820, the Federalist Party is totally gone. Partly because they seem like traitors, mostly because Republicans have started adopting, Madison specifically has started adopting the exact policies that the Federalists had called for. So if the Republicans are adopting the same policies, then what's the point of the Federalists? There is none. So they will vanish. So the United States, through all this, it proved that it was strong enough to deal with its internal problems. The United States became stronger during this period, and it proved it could deal with its problems. Its financial problems were dealt with by Hamilton's economic programs. The United States was able to deal with internal rebellions like the Whiskey Rebellion that it couldn't under the Articles. There were some times when the U.S. government went too far. The Alien and Sedition Acts during Adams' presidency, and then the Embargo Act during Jefferson's presidency. But it was able to strike somewhat of a balance between power and liberty. Second, under the Articles of Confederation, under the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. was able to get foreign nations to treat the United States with respect. The United States almost had a quasi-war with France. The United States got Spain to pass Pinckney's Treaty, and the United States will have to go back to war with England. But in the end, after the War of 1812, no European nation treats the United States with the same level of disrespect till we get to World War I and the Germans. That's another story. During this period, the United States also started evolving to become more democratic. Now, democracy, obviously, no minority and women cannot vote, but it moves in a more democratic direction. So the Federalists had wanted to stay elite-controlled, and because of the Republican dynasty, it will become more and more democratic. More and more white adult males only will participate in politics. Finally, it led to the rise of the first two political parties. One of them died out. The Republican Party will die out soon after this, in the next lecture. The question is, can the United States survive political parties? In 2021, I don't know. It's a good question.